In the frozen wasteland of the Eastern Front, where temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero and death stalked every trench, one man transformed warfare itself into an art form. While millions of soldiers struggled to survive in conditions that would break ordinary men, a single figure emerged from the white silence to rewrite the very definition of precision warfare. This is not a story about luck, courage, or even exceptional marksmanship. This is the account of a sniper whose mathematical precision with a rifle defied every law of probability, and whose legend would survive long after the last shots echoed across the steppes. The Eastern Front of World War II created a killing field unlike anything in human history, stretching across thousands of miles of brutal terrain, from the forests of Finland to the ruins of Stalingrad. It became a graveyard for over 20 million souls. But within this apocalyptic landscape, where entire armies vanished into the frozen earth, individual warriors could still change the course of battles through sheer skill and determination. What emerged from these conditions wasn't just another war story. It was the birth of modern sniper warfare, perfected by men who understood that sometimes a single bullet, placed with surgical precision, could accomplish what entire battalions could not. Among the countless soldiers who fought and died in this frozen hell, one name would rise above all others, not because of rank or political connections, but because of an ability so extraordinary that enemy forces would eventually place bounties on his head that exceeded the cost of entire military operations. His methodical, almost mechanical approach to killing charges, but with something far more unsettling. Story begins not with heroic speeches or dramatic battlefield who would become known as the deadliest sniper in military that turned warfare into a precise science. The man history started his journey in circumstances that seemed designed by fate itself. Born in a remote village where hunting wasn't a hobby, but a necessity for survival, he learned to shoot before most children learned to read. The forests around his childhood home became his classroom, where missing a shot meant his family went hungry, and where every squeeze of the trigger had to count. These weren't the manicured shooting ranges where modern soldiers train. These were wild landscapes where wind, weather, and moving targets created conditions that would humble even experienced marksmen. But natural talent alone doesn't create legends. What separated this individual from thousands of other skilled hunters was something far more rare. An almost supernatural ability to read the battlefield like a chess master reads the board, seeing patterns and opportunities invisible to ordinary soldiers. While others focused on immediate threats, he developed the capacity to think 3 moves ahead, positioning himself not where the enemy was, but where they would be. This cognitive advantage, combined with physical skills honed through years of necessity, would soon transform him from a simple farm boy into the most feared individual on the Eastern Front. The transformation began with a single shot fired in the early days of the invasion. Soviet forces were retreating across a landscape that offered little cover, pursued by German units that seemed unstoppable. In the chaos of that withdrawal, as thousands of soldiers fled in panic, one man took position behind a fallen log and began the systematic destruction of an entire enemy patrol. Not through rapid fire or explosive weapons, but through the methodical placement of individual bullets, each one claiming its target with mechanical precision. Witnesses later described the scene as otherworldly. Enemy soldiers simply dropping without warning, their comrades unable to locate the source of the deadly accuracy that was decimating their ranks. What made this encounter legendary wasn't just the number of casualties inflicted, but the psychological impact on surviving enemy forces. These were hardened veterans who had conquered most of Europe, soldiers accustomed to overwhelming their opponents through superior firepower and tactical coordination. But they had never faced an enemy who could kill them from distances that made retaliation impossible, whose shots seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously. The terror this created went beyond simple fear of death. It was the horror of facing an opponent who operated by rules they couldn't understand, whose capabilities exceeded anything in their training or experience. The weapon that would become synonymous with this deadly precision was itself a masterpiece of engineering simplicity. While other armies developed complex scoped rifles with advanced optics, the Eastern Front demanded something more reliable. The harsh conditions, where temperatures could freeze lubricants solid and moisture could fog the most sophisticated lenses, required equipment that functioned regardless of environmental extremes. The rifle that emerged from these demands was a testament to practical engineering. Robust enough to survive burial in snow for days, accurate enough to place shots at distances that challenged the limits of human vision, and simple enough that it could be maintained with basic tools under battlefield conditions. But the real innovation wasn't in the weapon itself. It was in how this sniper adapted standard equipment to create capabilities that shouldn't have been possible, through modifications that would have horrified military engineers. He transformed an ordinary rifle into an instrument of unprecedented precision. The process involved techniques learned through trial and error, adjustments made based on thousands of shots fired under every conceivable condition. Each modification was tested not on shooting ranges, but in actual combat, where failure meant death and success meant another enemy soldier would never return home. The mathematics of his shooting were staggering. Calculations that accounted for wind speed and direction, temperature variations that affected bullet trajectory, the natural breathing patterns of targets, and dozens of other variables that most snipers never even considered. He developed a mental database of ballistic information so comprehensive that he could make accurate shots under conditions where other marksmen couldn't even see their targets clearly. Fellow soldiers reported watching him make kills at distances they couldn't measure, in weather conditions that made visibility nearly impossible. More disturbing than his technical abilities was his approach to target selection. While ordinary snipers focused on obvious threats like officers and machine gun crews, he developed a systematic method for identifying targets whose elimination would create maximum psychological impact. Enemy soldiers reported that their units began to disintegrate not because of casualties, but because of the terror created by deaths that seemed to follow no predictable pattern. Men would die while performing routine tasks, in locations that should have been safe, killed by shots that seemed to come from impossible angles. The psychological warfare aspect of his operations was perhaps more effective than the physical casualties he inflicted. Enemy units operating in his sector began to exhibit symptoms of mass paranoia. Soldiers refused to move during daylight hours. Entire patrols would abandon their missions rather than risk exposure, and some units requested transfers rather than continue operating in areas where he was known to be active. The mere possibility of his presence was enough to paralyze enemy operations across vast stretches of the front lines. Intelligence reports from captured enemy documents revealed the extent to which his activities were disrupting their military operations. Entire divisions were being deployed not to advance against Soviet positions, but to hunt for a single individual whose location remained unknown. Resources that should have been used for offensive operations were instead diverted to counter-sniper activities that proved largely ineffective. The economic cost of these efforts exceeded the price of major military equipment, all focused on eliminating one soldier whose total equipment value was less than a single artillery shell. The German response escalated through increasingly desperate measures. First came counter-snipers, elite marksmen specifically trained to hunt their Soviet counterpart. These specialists arrived with the most advanced optics available, sophisticated camouflage equipment, and years of training in the precise skills needed for sniper versus sniper warfare. They established observation posts at key locations, coordinated their activities through advanced communication systems, and employed tactics that had proven successful in other theaters of war. None of it worked. The counter-snipers themselves became targets, their advanced equipment and specialized training proving worthless against an opponent who seemed to operate by entirely different rules. When individual specialists failed, the Germans deployed entire units dedicated to counter-sniper operations. These weren't ordinary soldiers, but specialists trained specifically for hunting snipers, equipped with the latest detection equipment and supported by artillery observers, who could call in concentrated fire on suspected sniper positions. The resources dedicated to this effort were staggering, involving hundreds of personnel whose primary mission was the elimination of a single enemy soldier. Yet despite their numbers, equipment, and specialized training, these units achieved nothing beyond adding to the casualty count. The escalation continued with the deployment of what German forces called sniper hunters, elite soldiers whose sole mission was tracking and eliminating enemy marksmen. These individuals represented the pinnacle of German military training, veterans of multiple campaigns who had proven their abilities against the most challenging opponents. They brought with them equipment that represented the cutting edge of military technology, including experimental optics and detection devices that had never been deployed in combat. Their arrival was accompanied by intelligence operations designed to gather information about their targets' methods, patterns, and possible locations. Thank you for joining us for this exploration into one of warfare's most extraordinary individual achievements. The story we're uncovering reveals how a single soldier's precision could terrorize entire army divisions and reshape battlefield tactics across thousands of miles of front lines. But what we've discovered so far is only the beginning. The true magnitude of this sniper's impact on the Eastern Front and the increasingly desperate measures taken to stop him will challenge everything you thought you knew about individual warfare. The hunt that ensued would involve some of the most elite soldiers in military history, cutting-edge technology, and tactics that had never been attempted on such a scale. Subscribe to witness how one man's deadly accuracy triggered the largest manhunt in military history. The German command's frustration reached levels that bordered on obsession. Reports filtered back to Berlin describing an enemy who seemed to possess abilities that transcended normal human limitations. Field commanders who had orchestrated successful campaigns across Europe found themselves utterly baffled by a single opponent whose methods defied conventional military wisdom. The situation became so dire that resources originally allocated for major offensive operations were redirected toward what military historians would later describe as the most expensive manhunt in warfare history. What made this pursuit even more maddening for German forces was the complete lack of reliable intelligence about their target. Standard reconnaissance methods yielded nothing. Aerial photography revealed no suspicious positions. Electronic surveillance detected no unusual communications. Interrogation of captured Soviet soldiers produced only contradictory accounts that seemed more like folklore than military intelligence. Some described a ghost who could appear and disappear at will. Others claimed he could shoot through solid objects. A few insisted he possessed multiple rifles and operated from several positions simultaneously. The truth, as military analysts would later discover, was both simpler and more terrifying than the supernatural explanations circulating among enemy troops. The sniper had developed a system of warfare that operated entirely outside conventional tactical doctrine. Rather than establishing fixed positions like traditional marksmen, he created a network of temporary hides that could be abandoned and reoccupied based on battlefield conditions. Each position was meticulously prepared with multiple escape routes, cached supplies, and firing angles calculated to maximize effectiveness while minimizing exposure. His selection of firing positions demonstrated an understanding of battlefield psychology that exceeded anything taught in military academies. Rather than choosing locations that offered the best fields of fire, he selected spots that would create maximum confusion and terror among enemy forces. A shot fired from an elevated position would send troops scrambling for cover in low ground, only to discover that their movement had exposed them to fire from a completely different angle. Enemy soldiers began to realize that their standard defensive procedures were not only ineffective, but were actually making them more vulnerable to attack. The methodical nature of his target selection revealed a strategic mind that thought far beyond individual kills. Each shot was calculated not just for its immediate impact, but for its effect on enemy morale and tactical decision-making. Officers were eliminated not because of their rank, but because their deaths would create specific types of chaos within enemy units. Communications personnel were targeted to disrupt coordination. Vehicle drivers were killed to strand equipment and personnel in exposed positions. Medical corpsmen were eliminated to deny aid to wounded soldiers, creating additional psychological pressure on their comrades. Perhaps most unsettling was his apparent ability to predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. German units would plan complex maneuvers designed to avoid known sniper positions, only to find themselves under precise fire from locations that should have been impossible to reach. Routes that had been cleared by advanced scouts became killing zones. Positions that offered excellent concealment became death traps. The enemy seemed to anticipate their every tactical decision, positioning himself not where they were, but where their own doctrine dictated they would move next. The psychological impact of these operations extended far beyond the immediate combat zone. Word of the snipers' activities spread throughout German forces via informal communication networks that military censorship couldn't control. Soldiers wrote letters home describing an enemy who seemed invincible. Veterans of previous campaigns admitted they had never faced anything comparable. New replacements arrived at the front, already terrified by stories they had heard during transport and training. The mere mention of his sector was enough to create visible anxiety among troops who had previously shown no fear of combat. German military leadership found themselves facing a crisis that no amount of traditional military thinking could solve. Standard counter-sniper tactics had proven completely ineffective. Overwhelming firepower couldn't eliminate a target they couldn't locate. Advanced technology offered no advantage against an opponent who seemed to operate outside the normal parameters of warfare. For the first time since the beginning of their Eastern campaign, German commanders were forced to acknowledge that they were facing an enemy who possessed capabilities beyond their understanding. The response that eventually emerged represented a fundamental shift in German tactical thinking. Rather than continuing to hunt for the sniper directly, they began implementing area denial strategies designed to make his operations impossible. Entire sectors were subjected to continuous artillery bombardment, not to hit specific targets, but to create conditions where no human being could survive for extended periods. Chemical weapons were deployed to contaminate areas where the sniper might establish positions. Engineering units were tasked with destroying any terrain features that could provide cover or concealment. These scorched earth tactics achieved some limited success in reducing sniper activity, but at a cost that military economists deemed unsustainable. The resources required to maintain continuous bombardment across potential sniper zones exceeded the logistical capacity of German supply lines. Artillery units that should have been supporting offensive operations were instead tied down in static defensive missions. Chemical weapons that were needed for breakthrough operations were consumed in area denial missions that produced no measurable military advantage. More problematic was the effect these tactics had on German forces themselves. Soldiers operating in areas subjected to continuous bombardment suffered from fatigue and psychological stress that reduced their combat effectiveness. Chemical contamination made large areas of territory unusable for German operations, as well as denying them to the enemy. The destruction of terrain features eliminated cover that German forces might need for their own operations. In their desperation to eliminate one enemy soldier, German commanders were systematically destroying the very territory they had fought to capture. The snipers' response to these escalated tactics demonstrated an adaptability that frustrated every German countermeasure. When continuous bombardment made traditional hide construction impossible, he developed techniques for operating from positions that could be occupied for minutes rather than hours. When chemical weapons contaminated his usual operating areas, he shifted to sectors where protective equipment would allow continued operations. When terrain was systematically destroyed, he learned to use the resulting rubble and crater fields as concealment for entirely new types of positions. Intelligence analysis of his evolving tactics revealed a mind that treated warfare as a complex puzzle to be solved through creative thinking rather than brute force. Each German countermeasure was met with innovations that not only negated the new threat, but often turned it into an advantage. Artillery bombardments that were intended to deny him cover instead created new firing positions among the resulting debris. Chemical contamination that was supposed to make areas uninhabitable became a form of protection that prevented German patrols from conducting effective searches. The most disturbing aspect of this tactical evolution was the sniper's apparent ability to learn and adapt faster than German forces could develop new countermeasures. Military doctrine typically required weeks or months to modify tactics based on battlefield experience. This individual seemed capable of analyzing new threats and developing effective responses within hours or days. German commanders found themselves fighting an opponent who improved his methods faster than they could identify his weaknesses. Field reports began describing encounters that challenged the fundamental assumptions of military combat. German soldiers reported being under accurate fire from positions that had been under direct observation minutes earlier. Patrols would locate what appeared to be recently used sniper hides, only to come under fire from completely different directions while investigating. Equipment left at firing positions suggested the sniper could move between locations faster than seemed humanly possible, leading to speculation about multiple individuals operating in coordination. The truth, as post-war analysis would reveal, was that the sniper had developed techniques for rapid position changes that incorporated elements of camouflage, route planning, and equipment management that were decades ahead of standard military practice. Rather than moving directly between positions, he used predetermined routes that took advantage of natural concealment and enemy blind spots. Instead of carrying all his equipment, he had established caches that allowed him to travel light while maintaining access to specialized tools at key locations. His equipment modifications had evolved into a system that prioritized mobility and concealment over raw firepower. The rifle that had started as a standard military weapon had been transformed through hundreds of small modifications into something that barely resembled its original configuration. Weight reduction techniques allowed for faster movement between positions. Specialized camouflage methods made detection nearly impossible even at close range. Modified ammunition provided enhanced accuracy while reducing the signature that might reveal his position. The weapon itself had become something that would have been unrecognizable to its original designers. Every component had been evaluated, modified, or replaced based on thousands of hours of field testing under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The stock had been carved and reshaped to provide perfect ergonomics for extended shooting sessions in cramped positions. The barrel had been carefully worked to eliminate microscopic imperfections that could affect accuracy at extreme ranges. Even the trigger mechanism had been refined through painstaking adjustments that allowed for the precise control necessary for shots that defied conventional ballistic limitations. But the true genius lay not in the modifications themselves, but in how they worked together as an integrated system. Each change had been made with consideration for how it would affect every other component. Weight distribution was calculated to provide perfect balance regardless of shooting position. The rifle's center of gravity had been precisely tuned to allow for rapid target acquisition while maintaining stability during the critical moments of shot placement. These weren't random improvements made by an amateur tinkerer. They represented the systematic refinement of a weapon by someone who understood both the science of ballistics and the art of precision shooting. The ammunition he used had undergone similar transformation through techniques that bordered on the alchemical. Standard military cartridges were disassembled and rebuilt, using components selected for their individual characteristics rather than mass production compatibility. Powder charges were measured to tolerances that exceeded factory specifications. Bullets were sorted by weight variations, measured in fractions of grains. Cartridge cases were inspected, modified, and prepared using methods that would have impressed civilian competitive shooters who had access to the finest reloading equipment. This obsessive attention to detail extended to every aspect of his operational methodology. Weather conditions were recorded and analysed to determine their effect on bullet trajectory at different ranges. Wind patterns were studied and categorised based on terrain features and atmospheric conditions. Temperature variations throughout the day were mapped and correlated with their impact on equipment performance. What emerged was a comprehensive understanding of ballistic science that rivaled the knowledge of weapons researchers working in controlled laboratory environments. The mathematical calculations required for his long-range shots involved variables that most snipers never considered. Atmospheric pressure changes that could deflect bullets by inches at extreme ranges. Humidity levels that affected powder burn rates and bullet stability. Even the rotation of the Earth became a factor in shots that required several seconds of flight time. These calculations were performed without electronic computers or ballistic calculators, using nothing more than mental arithmetic, refined through years of practical application. German intelligence services eventually obtained fragments of his modified ammunition from recovered battlefield sites. Analysis by weapons experts revealed manufacturing techniques that exceeded German military standards in several critical areas. The precision of the modifications suggested access to machine tools and measurement equipment that shouldn't have existed in Soviet field conditions. Some analysts theorized that the ammunition was being produced in specialized facilities behind Soviet lines and delivered to the sniper through dedicated supply chains. The reality was far more impressive than these theories suggested. The sniper had learned to create precision ammunition using improvised tools and techniques that would have challenged professional gunsmiths. Powder scales fashioned from salvaged materials provided accuracy that matched commercial reloading equipment. Bullet sorting methods developed through trial and error achieved consistency levels that exceeded factory specifications. Case preparation techniques refined through thousands of repetitions produced ammunition that performed better than anything available through normal military supply channels. His understanding of environmental factors reached levels that bordered on the supernatural. German observers reported instances where he seemed to anticipate weather changes hours before they occurred, positioning himself to take advantage of shifting wind patterns or atmospheric conditions that hadn't yet become apparent to meteorological instruments. Shots that should have been impossible due to crosswinds or thermal effects found their targets with mechanical precision, suggesting an ability to read environmental conditions that exceeded normal human perception. The truth was that years of constant observation had taught him to recognize subtle signs that preceded weather changes, cloud formations that indicated shifting wind patterns, atmospheric haze that revealed temperature gradients. Even the behavior of wildlife provided information about environmental conditions that could affect bullet trajectory. This knowledge, accumulated through countless hours of field observation, allowed him to make accurate shots under conditions where other marksmen couldn't even estimate the required corrections. His camouflage techniques evolved into something that resembled performance art more than military concealment. Rather than relying on standard ghillie suits or natural vegetation, he developed methods that incorporated psychological elements designed to exploit the expectations and assumptions of enemy observers. Positions were constructed to blend not just with the physical environment, but with the visual patterns that human eyes naturally overlooked. The result was concealment so effective that enemy soldiers could pass within feet of his positions, without detecting his presence. The psychological aspect of his camouflage was perhaps more important than its physical effectiveness. German soldiers began to report that terrain itself seemed hostile, that natural features appeared to shift and change when observed for extended periods. What they were experiencing was the disorienting effect of trying to locate something that existed at the very edge of visual perception. Their minds, struggling to process camouflage that operated outside normal parameters, began to create illusions that made accurate observation nearly impossible. Training documents recovered from German units revealed attempts to develop countermeasures for his advanced concealment techniques. Soldiers were instructed in recognition patterns for artificial camouflage materials. Observation protocols were modified to account for the psychological effects of extended surveillance. Optical equipment was upgraded with filters and magnification systems designed to penetrate sophisticated concealment. None of these measures proved effective against camouflage techniques that seemed to operate by principles unknown to military science. The sniper's movement patterns between positions demonstrated an understanding of human psychology that would have impressed behavioral researchers. Rather than using routes that offered the best physical concealment, he selected paths that took advantage of enemy expectations and assumptions. German patrols would search areas where logic dictated he should be, while he moved through terrain that seemed too exposed or dangerous for concealment. His ability to predict enemy search patterns allowed him to remain mobile, even when entire units were dedicated to tracking his movements. Intelligence analysis revealed that he had developed what amounted to a three-dimensional map of the battlefield that included not just physical features, but behavioral patterns of enemy forces. German units operated according to doctrinal procedures that made their movements predictable to someone who understood their tactical thinking. Supply convoys followed routes determined by engineering considerations. Patrol schedules were based on operational requirements that could be calculated in advance. Guard rotations followed patterns that created predictable windows of opportunity. This understanding of enemy behavior extended to individual soldiers as well as unit operations. German personnel files recovered after the war contained references to the sniper's apparent ability to identify and target specific individuals based on their roles and psychological profiles. Officers who showed exceptional courage were eliminated to demoralize their subordinates. Soldiers who demonstrated leadership potential were killed to prevent the development of informal command structures. Even support personnel were selected for elimination based on their impact on unit morale and effectiveness. The systematic nature of these targeting decisions revealed a strategic mind that thought in terms of psychological warfare rather than simple casualty production. Each death was calculated to create specific effects within enemy units. The elimination of popular soldiers created grief that affected unit cohesion. The killing of skilled specialists created operational difficulties that exceeded the simple loss of personnel. The targeting of individuals at specific moments maximized the psychological impact of their deaths on surviving comrades. German medical reports from the period document the unprecedented levels of combat stress experienced by soldiers operating in his sector. Symptoms included hypervigilance that prevented normal sleep patterns, paranoid behavior that interfered with unit among veteran personnel. Medical officers reported treating soldiers for operations, and anxiety reactions that reduced combat effectiveness, even conditions they had never encountered in previous campaigns. Psychological injuries that seemed to result from prolonged exposure to an indefinable threat. The most disturbing aspect of these medical reports was their description of soldiers who had never actually encountered the sniper directly, but were nevertheless displaying symptoms of severe psychological trauma. The mere knowledge that he was operating in their sector was sufficient to create debilitating stress reactions. Some soldiers requested transfers to units facing direct assault by Soviet armor, rather than continue operating in areas where he might be present. Others developed physical symptoms of illness that had no apparent medical cause, but rendered them unfit for combat duty. German command structures began to break down under the strain of operating against an enemy who seemed to violate every principle of conventional warfare. Officers trained in traditional military doctrine found their expertise useless against tactics that operated outside normal parameters. Communication systems designed for coordinating large-scale operations proved inadequate for tracking a single individual who could appear anywhere across vast stretches of territory. Intelligence networks that could monitor entire enemy divisions were helpless against an opponent who left no electronic signature and whose movements followed no predictable pattern. The failure of conventional military thinking to address the sniper threat created a crisis of confidence that extended throughout German command hierarchy. Field commanders, who had successfully managed complex operations across multiple theatres, found themselves unable to eliminate a single enemy soldier. Staff officers trained in strategic planning discovered that their analytical methods were useless against an opponent whose capabilities exceeded their theoretical frameworks. Even veteran non-commissioned officers began to question tactical doctrines that had proven successful in every previous campaign. This erosion of military confidence had consequences that extended far beyond tactical considerations. German forces began implementing increasingly desperate measures that defied standard operational procedures. Units that should have been advancing according to strategic timetables instead found themselves frozen in defensive positions, unwilling to move through terrain where the sniper might be operating. Supply convoys that were essential for maintaining offensive momentum were rerouted through circuitous paths that added days to delivery schedules. Entire divisions were effectively paralyzed by the actions of a single individual whose exact location remained unknown. The economic impact of these disruptions began to register at the highest levels of German command. Fuel consumption increased exponentially as vehicles were forced to use longer routes to avoid potential sniper zones. Ammunition expenditure soared as nervous troops fired at shadows and suspected positions that investigation revealed to be empty. Medical resources were diverted to treat psychological casualties who showed no physical wounds, but were nevertheless unable to function in combat roles. The cost of countering one enemy soldier had begun to exceed the expense of entire military operations. Intelligence reports flowing back to Berlin painted a picture of an enemy who seemed to possess capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about individual combat potential. Field commanders reported encounters that bordered on the impossible. Shots fired from positions that should have been physically inaccessible. Targets eliminated at ranges that exceeded the theoretical limits of the weapons involved. Tactical responses that anticipated German countermeasures before they were even implemented. These reports were so extraordinary that intelligence analysts initially dismissed them as exaggerations born of combat stress and fear. But as similar accounts accumulated from independent sources across hundreds of miles of front lines, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Multiple units were reporting encounters with what appeared to be the same individual, despite the physical impossibility of being in several locations simultaneously. The consistency of these reports, combined with the specific details that could be verified through battlefield investigation, forced German intelligence services to conclude that they were facing an opponent whose abilities transcended normal human limitations. The weapons research departments of the German military became obsessed with understanding how such extraordinary accuracy was being achieved. Captured Soviet equipment was subjected to detailed analysis in search of technological advantages that might explain the sniper's capabilities. Ballistics experts were consulted to determine if specialized ammunition or modified weapons could account for the reported performance. Optical specialists examined every piece of Soviet sighting equipment for innovations that might provide enhanced target acquisition capabilities. These investigations yielded disturbing conclusions. Soviet weapons technology, while adequate, showed no advantages over German equivalents. In many cases, German equipment was demonstrably superior in terms of precision, reliability, and optical performance. The ammunition being used by Soviet forces was standard military issue, that should have provided inferior accuracy compared to German specialized rounds. Even the telescopic sights available to Soviet snipers were crude by German standards, lacking the sophisticated reticles and precise adjustments that German marksmen took for granted. The realization that technological superiority offered no protection against this enemy created a new form of psychological warfare that, trained to rely on equipment advantages found themselves facing German forces had never experienced. Soldiers who had been an opponent who achieved superior results with inferior tools. The confidence that came from possessing the world's most advanced military technology evaporated when confronted with evidence that skill and determination could overcome any mechanical advantage. German research facilities began developing increasingly exotic solutions to counter the sniper threat. Experimental detection equipment was rushed into field testing. Devices that could allegedly identify human targets through sophisticated sensor arrays. Advanced camouflage materials were developed to provide concealment that should have been impenetrable to enemy observation. Specialized weapons were designed specifically for counter-sniper operations, incorporating technological innovations that represented the cutting edge of military science. None of these technological solutions proved effective against an enemy who seemed to operate according to principles that existed outside conventional military science. Detection equipment that could locate hidden enemies with scientific precision failed to identify the sniper's positions. Advanced camouflage that should have provided perfect concealment was penetrated with casual ease. Sophisticated weapons designed for precision long-range engagement were rendered useless by an opponent who never remained in one position long enough to be targeted. The failure of technology to provide solutions forced German military sophisticated training, and tactical superiority meant nothing when facing an individual hinkers to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of warfare itself. All their advanced equipment, who had transcended the normal limitations of human combat performance. The war they thought they understood had been transformed into something entirely different by a single enemy soldier whose methods operated outside every known parameter of military science. Psychological warfare specialists were brought in to analyze the broader implications of the sniper's activities on German military effectiveness. Their reports documented a phenomenon that had never been observed in previous conflicts. Entire army groups were being influenced by the actions of one individual whose actual contact with German forces was minimal. The vast majority of soldiers in his operational area had never seen him, never been shot at by him, and had no direct evidence of his presence. Yet their combat effectiveness was being systematically degraded by fear of an enemy who might not even exist in their immediate vicinity. This psychological impact operated through mechanisms that military psychologists struggled to understand. Traditional combat stress resulted from direct exposure to life-threatening situations that soldiers could identify and respond to. The sniper created a different type of psychological pressure that was harder to define but equally debilitating. Soldiers found themselves under constant stress from a threat that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, immediate and distant, real and imaginary. The most unsettling aspect of this psychological warfare was its self-perpetuating nature. Fear of the sniper created behavioral changes that actually made German forces more vulnerable to his attacks. Soldiers who clustered together for psychological comfort created larger targets. Units that avoided movement during daylight hours became predictable in their routines. Personnel who refused to occupy elevated positions eliminated their own observation advantages. In their attempts to avoid the sniper's attention, German forces were systematically degrading their own tactical effectiveness. Medical officers reported treating soldiers for symptoms they had never encountered in previous campaigns. Combat veterans who had shown exceptional courage under fire developed paralyzing anxiety when assigned to sectors where the sniper was known to operate. Experienced non-commissioned officers who had led successful operations across multiple theatres requested reassignment rather than face an enemy they couldn't understand. Even support personnel who rarely saw direct combat began with their ability to perform essential displaying stress reactions that in-turf duties. The sniper's impact on German communication systems created operational difficulties that cascaded throughout their command structure. Radio operators became reluctant to transmit from fixed positions, fearing that electronic emissions might reveal their locations. Telephone lines were abandoned when linesmen refused to maintain connections in areas where the sniper might be active. Message runners began taking circuitous routes that delayed critical communications for hours or even days. The entire information network that enabled coordinated military operations was being systematically disrupted by fear of a single enemy soldier. The legacy of this extraordinary marksman extends far beyond the frozen battlefields where he earned his lethal reputation. His story reminds us that in warfare's most desperate hours, individual excellence can reshape entire campaigns through nothing more than unwavering precision and tactical brilliance. The Eastern Front produced countless heroes and legends, but none demonstrated more clearly how one soldier's mastery of his craft could terrorize divisions and rewrite the rules of combat itself. In those endless white expanses where millions perished, a single rifle became an instrument of psychological warfare that no amount of technology or manpower could counter.